Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the event on coronavirus, furloughing and employment law, hosted by the Greater Birmingham Chambers of Commerce. Now, we're just waiting for a few more people to join, so we'll give it a couple of minutes before we dive into the main event. Okay, so I think a few more people have joined, so I should really make a start. So for those who don't know me, I'm Raj Kandola, Senior Policy and Patron Advisor at the Chamber, and I'd like to welcome you all to today's event. Now, the term furloughing, it's something that I wasn't particularly familiar with about a month ago, but as we know, it's become an important part of everyday language in the last few weeks, given the extraordinary events that we're living through right now. And really what we wanted to do today was think about what this really means from a business perspective and how it's entwined with employment law. So I'm delighted to say that we're joined by Charlie Frost, who's a partner at Squire Patton Boggs, who will talk about the intricacies of furloughing and what it means for the business community. As you can see in front of you, in terms of an agenda, I'll hand over to Charlie shortly, but before I do so, what I'll do is I'll quickly run through the main elements of our Keep Business Moving campaign, which this webinar is a key part of. Charlie, as you can see, will present for around 20 to 25 minutes. And then afterwards, we'll have time for a Q&A session. And we'll look to finish the session around 11:45. So if you would like to ask a question at any point, do write it in the chat box, which is on the right-hand side, and we can ask it on your behalf during the Q&A. Also, if you encounter any technical difficulties, please consult the Click Meeting troubleshooting Q&A in the first instance, and you can see the link in front of you. Now, many of you will be familiar with the Keep Business Moving campaign, but for those of you who are not, just in front of you, as you can see, is just a quick overview of what it entails. And I think the Keep Business Moving campaign is very much in line with the Chamber's raison d'etre around helping local businesses connect, support and grow. So from a connect perspective, we're helping to connect with fellow businesses through our hashtag GB Chamber Chat, which takes place every weekday between 11 a.m. and 12 p.m. on Twitter. We're still running our member-to-member offers, so please do check those out. From a support perspective, we're supporting your business through our COVID-19 hub, which is, again, an information hub which contains lots of information in terms of the various support mechanisms which are out there for local firms right now to deal with the crisis. We're running a number of informative webinars, such as this one. We've still got our free legal and HR helpline, which you can access via your relationship manager. And of course, we're undertaking a raft of lobbying and campaign activity, liaising with both national and local stakeholders. So again, if you've got any case studies or any examples of any difficulties or challenges that you're facing right now that you want us to share, then please do let us know. And we can obviously keep sharing those with our contacts at both Westminster and Whitehall. We're also supporting government appeals as well for sourcing ventilators, hand sanitizer, and protective clothing. And that's a campaign that we're working with the West Midlands Combined Authority on, which we expect will pick up pace in the next couple of weeks. And of course, growing awareness of your business. We're still interested in thought leadership content. So if you've got blog posts or videos or tips for responding to COVID-19 or anything from working digitally and remotely, please do share that with us. And of course, we have our Chamberlink daily articles as well, which again, showcase your business latest views and initiatives responding to coronavirus. And they go out to 14,000 subscribers. So if you'd like any more information, please do visit the website link, as you can see there. And just before I hand over to Charlie, I should say that we are running another webinar tomorrow, which is Coronavirus Need to Know Legal Advice. So we're going to be joined by Claire Francis, who's a partner at Pinsent Masons. We'll be talking about the legal complexities around coronavirus and what it means for your business. So again, that's taking place, same time tomorrow, 11 to 11:45. It's an online webinar. It'd be great if you can join us. And without any further delay, I'll hand over to Charlie.
Thanks, Raj. Hope everybody can hear me okay. It's a pleasure to speak to you all. Since these government announcements were made just over 2 weeks ago now, we've talked about very little else for all of our clients. It's hit every single business that we do business with. We've had lots of new clients coming through with queries. That's my pick today. Head up the Labour and Employment team at the Birmingham office of Squire Patton Boggs. You can see what 3 weeks of lockdown has done to me in terms of aging me. I think that photo was a few years ago. But I'm going to whiz through some of the most frequently asked questions, because there was an awful lot of information being fired out by all law firms. We're conscious of that. We try to put our own different spin on things. So if you want to keep abreast of the latest developments, we do have our Employment Law Worldview blog, and we're regularly putting out practical guidance on that. And some of the points that we've picked up as a group of partners across the UK, there's 15 of us that dial in at 8 o'clock every morning, and we share the views that are coming in from the different clients, and we're looking at best practice and what is actually everybody else doing in practice, because that's what everybody wants to know. How is everybody approaching this? So I will go through the key points here from the job retention scheme. So just starting with the main questions that we're getting. What is the new job retention scheme? I'm not going to go through all of those key points because I think everybody that's dialed in, but basically it is a scheme designed by the government to make sure that when we come through this crisis and on the other side, everybody hasn't been laid off or made redundant by their employers, because the impact is so huge. So what the government has done is to put in place a scheme whereby employers can put people on furloughed worker status. That means they're at home doing nothing. They can't be working for you at all. And provided that they are notified that they're on furlough leave status, they can then claim up to 80% of their wages, capped at £2,500 a month per employee. And there's no overall cap on what the government will provide for this. And to put that in context, it's been absolutely hammered by the private sector. So BA have already confirmed that over 30,000 of their employees are going to be on furlough leave. If you think of the fact that the taxpayer is picking up 80% of those costs at £2,500 a month per employee, the costs of this are going to be huge. So when it was initially rolled out, the government said it would run for 3 months from the 1st of March, so you could apply it retrospectively for some candidates. We do wonder, it said it may be extended, we do wonder whether that will be the case, because the uptake has been far greater than I think anybody imagined. There was a lot of questions from employers as to how many employees they can put in and whether they're eligible, because what is the criteria? The government's relaxed the criteria in the most recent guidance that was issued on Saturday. So it just shows that, just goes on to say, as long as your business is severely affected, and recognises that some businesses are going to be affected more than others. So the interesting thing of that is, we don't actually have any law at the moment. All that we have is the job retention scheme guidance that has been rolled out by the government on the government UK website. It was updated most recently on Saturday. Alongside that, we've got the ACAS guidance, which gives a bit further details around it. The ACAS guidance is informative, but it's only guidance. It has no legal framework around it, and it's not legally binding. So we're left in a very unusual situation for you as employers, whereby we have a set of new rules that is applying retrospectively from 1st of March. It only runs until the end of May, on the basis it's the first 3 months. And because of that, we're all operating in a vacuum of any actual legislation that undersits all of this and confirms the finer details of how this all works. So there was a large part of second guessing what the guidance means, and the government is trying to play catch up. It's been done with the best intentions. I think it's been well received by business. So it's been rolled out. Businesses are happy that they've got this option to put stuff on furlough leave, but what does it actually mean, and how can they take advantage of it? And the big worry for everybody are, if we put people on furlough scheme and we try to claw back the 80% from HMRC, when can we get the money back, for starters, which I'll come on to? But also, is there any risk that HMRC might look at this retrospectively and say, we've claimed monies that we shouldn't have been entitled to, and therefore we don't get them back via the online portal when it's up and running? So we'll come on to those points. There was further guidance issued at the weekend to say you can re-employ some employees that left you, provided that they were on your books after the 28th of February this year. I do have some clients that are taking advantage of that, more out of doing the right thing morally to help out employees who have left on good terms to go and take up a job with a new employer. But because of the coronavirus situation, the new employer has pulled the job and they're left between old job and new job, so that they can't take advantage of the furlough scheme. And the government has clarified over the weekend that former employers can take staff back on to take advantage of that. And the new guidance also makes clear that employees and workers on flexible or 0-hour contracts can claim this. So the key point is, was the employee on your PAYE payroll system as at 28th of February 2020? And if they were, you can make a claim for them. Anybody that started after that date, unfortunately, you can't claim for those. So how does it work in practice? You need to designate your affected employees as furlough workers. And the guidance says you must make any changes to the employment contract by agreement. And I'll come on to the tricky issue of consent in a moment. You must write to the employee confirming the furlough arrangements. So we've been producing some standard letters that employers are fine-tuning to their own particular arrangements and whether they're doing top-up arrangements. But you have to write to confirm it. And it's important that you keep a record of that, because HMRC have confirmed in the most recent guidance that you need to keep records of those letters or those emails for 5 years in case they want to do an audit retrospectively. And HMRC have made it very clear that they are prepared to come back and audit employers to make sure that people haven't been taking advantage of this scheme. Whether they've got the resources to do that whole scale, probably not, but you don't want to be the employer that is ill audited and doesn't have all the paperwork in place. So 2 things. 1, make sure you've got a proper audit trail and paper trail in place to show why you felt that you were eligible to exercise the right to take furlough scheme under the scheme. Just generally, as a general rule, you should have a business rationale as to why COVID-19 has affected your business. For some businesses, that will be obvious. For others, you might need to do a little bit of work to explain what were the measures and why was staff at risk of redundancy, or why was the business severely affected by this crisis. That's just a straightforward paper trail exercise. But then you must also make sure you've got letters to each employee confirming the furlough arrangements. You then submit that information to HMRC about the furloughed employees and their earnings via a new online portal. And because this is all brand new and being raced out, that isn't up and running yet. We did have one question come through as to when is this going to be up and running. The latest guidance says they hope it be by mid-April, certainly by late April. We haven't had any further confirmation from HMRC as to whether that's the case. And that's left employers in a lot of dilemma because everybody is strapped for cash at the moment. Business is not what it was a month ago. And they're saying we haven't got the resources to pay staff. That's certainly the case for some clients. We just can't put through the March and April payroll waiting for HMRC to get its act together and be able to reimburse us. As it stands, the guidance is clear that the primary responsibility for paying employees remains with you as the employer. And if you want to take advantage of the scheme, you have to make sure that you pay that minimum 80% of normal wages, capped at £2,500 per month. You can top it up if you want, but you're not obliged to. But you have to meet the minimum statutory obligations, and you can't take a fee out of that 80% either. So you pay the money to the employees, and then you claim it back retrospectively from HMRC via the online portal. And fingers crossed, that will be set up by the end of April so that people can start using it properly. What we don't have, unfortunately, is any guidance as to when that monies will come back to you and how quickly they will come back to you. And unfortunately, that means what the government is expecting people to do is, or businesses to do, is to take out short-term loans in order to cover the costs of the payroll and to bridge that gap between making the 80% payments to the staff and being able to get reimbursed via the HMRC online arrangements. So not an entirely satisfactory state of affairs. It is welcome to have 80% contribution from the government. Well, getting your hands on that money might not be as quick for businesses as we first hoped. And we are reassured that HMRC are throwing all their resources at getting this online portal set up. And the pressure for them to do so is going to be huge because of the uptake of the scheme. What is the 80% contribution and can you top up? As I've said, the minimum contribution is the 80%. On top of that 80% for normal wage costs, the government will also cover the employer tax and minimum statutory pension contribution. So that's the 3% statutory auto-enrolment pension arrangements. They will be covered as well, in addition to the £2,500, along with employers' national insurance contributions. There is some lack of clarity about, does the scheme automatically allow you to drop down auto-enrolment contributions to 3%? On the issue of the first guidance, we thought that was probably the case. The updated guidance came through on Saturday morning suggests otherwise. So I think the better view is probably the 3% is the minimum that you can, or that is all that you can claim back from the government by way of contribution for pension arrangements. But if you are already making employer contributions of 4, 5, or 6% or more, you are still obliged to make those additional pension contributions unless you agree otherwise with the employees. So that's something to cover off when you're having the discussion about what the furlough leave arrangements are going to be, and also to make sure that you cover that off in the furlough leave letter or the email that you send to employees advising them that they're on furlough leave and the terms of those furlough arrangements. The employees pays tax on the £2,500. That was clarified early on by the government. And as I've said, you can do top-ups, but you're not obliged to do so. We're seeing all sorts of creative arrangements around this. Some employers are disapplying the the 80% cap. That's where it's got the cut off at 2,500, so everybody gets 80%. Some employers are paying at 100%, so topping it up fully. Others are doing a halfway house where they'll pay 100% for the first 4 weeks to take people through to the end of April, where the scheme was launched in early April. But then going into May, they drop it back down to the statutory amount. So you do have the flexibility around that. As I say, you just need to make sure that you meet the minimum statutory contribution, and then what you do in addition to that is at your discretion. And I've already touched on the point that the scheme works on the basis that you have to pay your staff first, and then you get the 80% contribution back. And if you can't, if you haven't got the funds available, the government's unfortunately just expecting you to take out a short-term loan to cover the cost of that. This is the big one that was troubling most people and still is troubling most people, because what it actually says is, do we need employee consent? Everybody is asking that question, because in theory or in practice, none of this guidance changes the fact that if you are fundamentally changing employees' terms and conditions to put them on furlough in circumstances where you didn't normally have the right to put them on layoff, and if you're trying to make people take time off work and enforce that and reduce their pay, well, then all the normal contractual principles of employment law still apply. Against that, we're in a situation where the government's saying employee consent should be obtained before the changes are put through. Thankfully, they're not making it a condition of the payment of the furlough 80% contribution that consent is actually obtained. So you can still obtain the furlough contribution from the government, even if you haven't got an express record of consent from the employee. So the question then becomes, well, how are we going to roll this out? Where employers can, best practice is to get the express consent of the employees. And for small populations of employees, that's achievable, that's feasible to do. You can speak to employees directly. We're dealing with a number of employers that have thousands of employees dotted all around the country at different sites, branches, offices, and locations, and it's just not going to be feasible. They needed to move quickly 1 or 2 weeks ago. And therefore, the pragmatic approach, even though it's possibly in breach of collective consultation and individual consultation rights and expectations, the pragmatic approach was to go out to the workforces, set out what the proposals were, inviting comments, inviting queries to be raised, but not inviting objections, because you don't want to invite trouble. Where the unions were involved, properly engaging with the unions with a quick heads up to make sure that they were on board with the proposals and weren't going to require the business to go through collective consultation across various different locations, and then just implementing the scheme and rolling it out in order to be able to move quickly in response to what is clearly an emergency. That probably falls foul of a number of employment laws. In an ideal world, we would comply with all of that. Businesses are taking a pragmatic view and saying, we need to do this, we need to do it quickly. The scheme is only running until the 31st of May, so we can't be hanging around for 30 or 45 days to collectively consult people. And with individual consultation, if people have individual objections, we'll speak to them on a case-by-case basis and try and get them on board, but we're not going to make exceptions to the rule here. We are going to dictate what the furlough leave arrangements are. If we can get express consent, great, but if that's not realistic or pragmatic, we'll just go down the implied consent route and we'll roll it out, tell employees this is what's happening, and give them the option to raise any questions or queries. So that isn't without risk. We think the risks are mitigated by the circumstances. We think the benefit of getting the furlough arrangements in place quickly to take advantage from it quickly, in many cases, will outweigh the perennial risk of potential complaints and claims. An interesting aside is the employment tribunal system is currently on its knees as well, because it doesn't have staff around, and therefore nothing much is happening quickly on the employment tribunal front. So in reality, anybody that isn't happy about it doesn't have much resource. The trade unions are being sensible about it. They understand the situation employers find themselves in, and they are, on the whole, encouraging employees to take a pragmatic view of this and say, listen, this is a one-off exceptional event. This doesn't compromise your position or the trade union's role generally, and it's the best thing for the business. This is all about the long-term survival of businesses in order that they have a business to come back to when we get to the other side of all of this, and that the employees can come back and have jobs to come back to rather than being made redundant, which can only add to the disastrous effect that this could have on UK businesses. So it's all about keeping businesses operational once we come through the worst of this. You do have flexibility on the scheme. There are a number of elements where employers are thinking, okay, so we can top up, or we can decide whether we rotate staff or whether we take on former employees and bring them back. And that's all great. The government encourages you to try and make use of this furlough scheme where it's appropriate to do so, rather than having employees that are former employees or current employees that are unemployed. Just a word of caution: whenever you've got a situation where you're exercising your discretion, you need to be aware that you're not falling foul of UK discrimination laws. Otherwise, you're inviting trouble because claims could be raised. So if you think about that and take a step back, when you're deciding who should be furloughed, make sure it's not made on discriminatory basis. When you rotate staff, and who you decide might rotate staff, that helps avoid accusations that you've favoured one group of employees over another. Whether you apply the top-up or disapply the 2,500 cap, again, if you apply that to everybody, that's fine. But if you apply it piecemeal and only parts of the business, then you're opening yourself up to accusations, unless you've got a good business rationale, that you've done so in a discriminatory manner. And if you're deciding you might rehire employees to help them take advantage of the furloughing arrangements now that the government has confirmed you can take staff back on, again, just have to be a little bit careful, because if you've had acrimonious terminations, in particular where employees have alleged discrimination or raised grievances about the way that they were treated on the grounds of a protected characteristic, if you decide not to take them back on because they were troublemakers and you take other employees back on, you could walk into a potential discrimination or victimization claim. So whilst trying to do the right thing for employees that left on good terms, just make sure you don't expose yourself to claims from employees that left on not so good terms. Can you rotate furloughed staff? This was the big question last week. It's less controversial now because the new guidance that came out has clarified that yes, you can. You can put employees on more than one period of furlough. There was a minimum period of 3 weeks. So you've got to comply with the minimum period of furlough, which is 3 weeks, in order to claim the 80% contribution. There's lots of questions knocking around generally about, what about holiday? What about sick leave? What about maternity? Does that break the 3-week furlough? The honest answer is the government hasn't really clarified that position in the guidance, in particular around the holiday leave. So we're still waiting for further guidance on that. There was some update of the ACAS guidance overnight, which suggests that bank holidays won't interrupt a period of furlough. And if that's right, then you'd wonder whether that extends to the wider annual leave system. The ACAS guidance also makes it clear that employees should be allowed to take holidays where they've requested it, which again opens the door to arguments, well, that shouldn't then interfere with the furlough leave period. But it does beg the question, what about where the employer enforces the annual leave? Is that a different scenario? It's really disappointing. The one question that all of us, employers and employment lawyers alike, wanted to know on the weekend when the guidance was updated is, give us more clarity about annual leave, because that's what everybody wants to know. How do we deal with that? And it's the one question that the government's guidance update body swerved and just sidestepped altogether, probably because the answers are too difficult at this stage. It's a really undesirable state of affairs with the bank holidays coming up. I think the best view at the moment is continue to allow the bank holidays to run. Most employers are paying the bank holidays at 100%. Some employers are paying it at 80%, but reserving the right to top up if the government guidance clarifies that's the case. So it's a case of watch this space. You would hope that they would issue some guidance soon, but they're going to have to get a wiggle on with Good Friday only a couple of days away now. Can the employee work or train when furloughed? So they can't work at all for you, so they can't do any work. This furlough scheme only applies to employees that are working at home and not doing anything. Staying at home and not doing anything. If they're doing short-time working or they're doing part-time working during the period, then they become ineligible for the furlough grant of 80%. They can do other jobs. So if they've already got 2 jobs, the fact that you put them on furlough doesn't stop them continuing with their other job. A separate question is, what about if you put them on furlough and they take up a new job with somebody else? Well, there's nothing under the scheme that stops them doing that. So it comes down to a question of whether you would be happy for them to do that, and does your contract prevent that? But under the scheme, they can do other jobs for other employers. It's just that they can't do anything that generates an income for you. And that extends to volunteer work and training. So they can provide volunteer work and they can do training. It just must not provide a service to your company or generate income for you. Otherwise, you become unable to claim the money. But provided it doesn't provide a service to you or generate income for you, they can go off and do volunteer work and they can do training. There is the requirement to provide national minimum wage during periods of training, but in most cases, the 80% contribution should more than adequately cover that. I've already touched on the holiday situation, and there was also separate guidance that the government has issued to say that people can roll over the 4-week statutory holiday, so the 20 days for 2 years. So a lot of noise and alerts have gone out around that subject. Do note that that just applies to the statutory position. So our view is that in most cases, employees should be able to use the first 20 days of holiday each year, which means that they wouldn't have any statutory holidays to roll over. But if they do, then that's something else that you're carrying the cost of and you will have to pay out on termination. The guidance is clear that employees on statutory sick pay are not eligible for furlough, so they have to finish the statutory sick pay arrangements, and once they do so, they can come on to the furloughed leave arrangements. That does open the interesting question of whether employees who are off sick but are worse off on SSP than they would be if they are on furlough leave suddenly have a Lazarus type resurrection and are able to come back to work in order to take advantage of the higher paid furlough arrangements. We think that will happen. Whether anybody can ever prove that is a different thing, but it's a bit of a quirk of the system that you have to finish the SSP before you can get furlough. And for maternity leave, the guidance just clarifies that they continue to receive statutory maternity pay in the normal way, even if that's less than furlough pay. But the employer can claim back the 80% in relation to the enhanced contractual element of any maternity pay, again, subject to the £2,500 cap. So that, I think, brings me nicely right on 11:30, now 11:31, to the situation, to the any questions. We've got 15 minutes to cover those.
Brilliant, Charlie. Thank you so much for that. Really informative and really helpful. So if I just go back to the start, I think James Roberts had a question on the online portal for JROS. When will it be available? When can we expect furlough payments to be made? I think you've obviously covered a lot of those points. We also had a couple of other questions, and I'll just obviously just share them with you, and then we can run through the topics in a bit more detail. I think Sarah mentioned whether we could email the slide deck out following the webinar. Teresa Carson as well. I'll just show the question list here. We've got one here from Jeff Whittingham. Company directors are now in the scheme as of Saturday. What work can they do if they're furloughed?
So the guidance clarifies that they can do their minimum obligations to discharge their statutory duties, but they shouldn't do more than that. So you don't sidestep the normal furlough rules that you can't do stuff to generate income or for the benefit of a service to the company, but it's accepted that company directors do still have directors' duties, obligations to discharge under the Companies Act. So provided they keep their duties to a minimum to discharge those obligations, they're not going to step outside of the furlough protection.
Brilliant, thank you. We also saw a question earlier on from Teresa Carson, which said, how about employees that are paid weekly? They work different hours, less than 40 hours, or overtime?
Sure. So the guidance separates out, and it's worth having a quick read through, because it's, even though it's lacking on detail, at least it has some information in this area. And what it does make clear is that for people on a permanent salary and wage, you just take what their salary was as at 28th of February 2020, and that's the figure that you use for working out the 80% contribution. For other employees where they have variable pay arrangements, they have separate arrangements in place for those employees, and you take into account the same amount of money that they would have earned in the corresponding month for the previous year. So that gives you a good tally as to how you work it out. And there is two different criteria, two different options. So you have a look at that. And again, they've also got special guidance in place for employees that have only just started and have done less than 12 months service. So for those that have done 12 months service, you take the corresponding month from the previous year. For other employees that have started more recently, the guidance has some particular frameworks as to how you arrange that and what you look at. And it's really just the immediate months beforehand, depending on how long they've been with you.
Thanks, Charlie. We have another question from Christine Fiddis. How long will it take the government to pay back to the employer furlough payments made?
That's a great question. I think we touched on it earlier. We don't know the answer to that. All that the government has said is that they hope the online system will be up and running by mid to late April. They're hoping that employers will be able to take advantage of putting that communications through for the payroll, for the April payroll run. And what they haven't said is how quickly employers will be reimbursed the furlough payments. And so we all wait with bated breath for the government or HMRC to give further guidance on that. Not entirely satisfactory, and all that we've seen is snippets from the government saying that people can take out short-term loans. We do have some clients that specialise in short-term loans, and business is booming for them for precisely this reason.
Brilliant. We've also got a question from Jay Hensman, which says, relating to the question about directors, is it acceptable to continue to tender for future work to avoid redundancies by providing work when the restrictions are lifted? Tendering doesn't generate revenue now.
I think that's probably going to fall foul of actually doing work for a service for the company. So the idea is that people that are taking benefit of furlough are at home doing nothing. And what you're really talking about there is business development, which is for some people their actual day job. And I appreciate that for directors, it may not always be their day job, but in reality, they are doing work on behalf of the business. So I think if you're actively out there doing work to try and generate income, that would fall foul of the scheme, and you wouldn't be able to claim for those employees.
And we have a question from Pam Offer. If an employee has a contract of working 4 days, but over the last 6 months might have worked a couple of weeks at 5 days, do we stick to the 4 days?
So for employees that have a fixed salary, you take their fixed salary as at the 28th of February. I suspect, looking at it, is a bit of a complicated question and scenario, so it's rather unique. It may fall into the category of employees with variable pay arrangements, in which case the alternative rules for calculating apply, and for that you take into account form overtime payments. You can put in compulsory commission payments, which is an interesting point that's come up a lot and worth just touching on. We've had a lot of questions since the guidance on Saturday. What does it mean by compulsory commission payments? Because you can include compulsory commission payments in the 80% calculation, but you can't include other commission payments, i.e. discretionary ones. I think our view generally is that most commission payments will be contractual. Once targets or thresholds are met, the commissions become due and payable, and have been paid by most employers without any exception, meaning that even if the contract refers to them as discretionary, or even if that's how they've been communicated in the commission scheme, if they are always paid and always have been paid on the criteria being met by the employees, which is the entire purpose of a commission arrangement, then it's difficult to see that they're not contractual. Either they're contractual because of the express terms, or they become contractual due to custom and practice. So we think commission payments, in most cases, there will be a good argument for including those in the calculation for the variable pay employees.
Thanks, Charlie. We have a couple of other questions now. We've got one from, I think, Al Kemal. If an existing employee is on maternity leave, can they be furloughed under the scheme?
So the scheme isn't clear, the guidance isn't clear on what the employee's status is whilst they're on maternity leave. It does say that they continue to take the benefit of statutory maternity pay in the normal way. And it does say that any enhanced company maternity pay can be clawed back, but just the contractual element, not the statutory maternity pay. So the contractual maternity pay can be clawed back as 80% under the scheme. And because they say that, we can only infer from that that they mean if you can claw back 80% of the contractual maternity pay, you must be able to be on furloughed status whilst you're on maternity leave. But you would think that they would make that very clear and expressly clear within the guidance, and they haven't done so. So yes, short answer is we're not sure. We know you can claim back the 80% for the contractual element, and that's as far as the government has taken. My own personal view means that they must accept that people on maternity leave can be furloughed, but there isn't any clear guidance on that yet.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Steve McCabe. If a new starter joined the company in mid-February and received half a month's pay in that month, can we now claim a full month's furlough value for March onwards through the scheme?
So the way the scheme works is, provided they were on the books and on the payroll by 28th of February 2020, then they're eligible to be put on furlough leave. That's the only criteria that you have for the employees, for the employee side of things. They just needed to be on your books. So this employee falls into that camp. Okay, they only joined halfway through February, but they got in just on time. So now that they can be put on furlough leave along with anybody else that's been on the books before the 28th of February. You would then take, with most employees that have been on the books for 12 months, you take their salary at the 28th of February. There are special rules that apply for calculating what new starters' pay would be. So have a little look at the guidance for that. There is a very clear little section for new starters as to how you decide what they're paid, and it depends on whether they are on a fixed salary or whether they're on variable pay. If they're on a fixed salary, you could just take the 28th of February payment.
Brilliant, thank you.
I should clarify, actually, where we're saying, can you claim a full month's furlough value for March? The scheme applies retrospectively back to the 1st of March. It only applies to employees that you put on furlough leave. Now, if they've already been on unpaid layoff going back to the 1st of March, then the government has confirmed it can apply retrospectively to those employees. But if they were on paid leave before the 29th of February, then you can't claim furlough leave for them. So you have to be careful. For most people that you're claiming for, there will be an obvious start date as to when they were put on furlough leave for March, and you can only claim back furlough for the period from which the furlough leave was said to start for that employee, and that should be communicated clearly in the furlough leave letter that is sent to them.
Charlie, I think we've got another question here from Alchemy. If an employee is furloughed and taken back after 3 weeks, is there a time limit to wait if you need to furlough them again?
That's a really good question, because we've been asked it a lot of times and there isn't any guidance on it. Our view is, provided each period of furlough leave is at least 3 weeks long, it doesn't matter how short the gap is between those periods of furlough leave. And you can only make one claim for furlough subsidy in each period, but that doesn't mean you can't have somebody on furlough for 3 weeks, bring them back for a few days to do a few days work, and then put them again on furlough leave, as far as we can see. So pending any further clarification on that, I think the short answer is there isn't really a time limit. You can put them straight back on furlough leave within a matter of days.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, and thank you for the question. I'm just checking to see if there's any final questions now before we wrap up shortly. I can see a couple of people typing. I do understand that a number of people have suffered some issues around the sound quality, not being able to hear. So as my colleague has said in the chat box, we will be publishing this on YouTube. So we can send a link out to all of the attendees to obviously follow that up. We have seen another question come through, actually, Charlie, from Sarah Frost, which, as you can see, is, can the 3-week block be consecutive, so rolling 3-week blocks?
It can be. I mean, where you have one 3-week block rolling consecutively into the next 3-week block, as far as I can see, that would just be a 6-week block of furlough leave. So some employers have sent out furlough leave letters saying we reserve the right at any time to rotate you, and we can do so on short notice. So if you build that protection in, or that right into your furlough leave letter, then you don't need to put in any complicated arrangements saying that we're putting you on consecutive rolling 3-week blocks of furlough leave. You could just say, well, you're on furlough leave until further notice, and then reserve the right to give them short notice when they're required back in, and making it clear in the same letter that you reserve the right to rotate them and to put them on furlough leave again on a rotation basis if necessary. So I think you can cover it off in the furlough leave letter by putting in short notice provisions and the right to rotate without needing to do too technical analysis. I did see one client that tried to put in this type of arrangement when it was first released, and we drafted a letter on the basis of rolling 3-week periods, and then we thought, actually, that's overcomplicating it. We can do it much easier just with a short notice period. And you're talking about a matter of days' notice to employees to get them back into the office. It is also useful to put in the furlough leave letter requirement that employees give you an up-to-date telephone number and email address so you can get hold of them during the furlough leave, just so that if you do want to call them back in, you know which number to get them on and how to communicate with them.
Brilliant. Thank you. That's great. Charlie, thank you so much. We're coming up to the end now, so I just have one last question for yourself. So what's your takeaway for the business community? What do you think? Is there anything in particular that you've touched upon today that they should be fully aware of?
I think the most important thing is to make sure everybody is moving very quickly with all of this. Make sure that your paperwork is in place, because at the moment the government is in crisis mode, and it's rolled this out very quickly to make sure that employees do have a job to come back to, and the finer details are going to come out at some stage, and they might draw some further clarifications and might say, well, when we said this in the guidance, what it actually meant was that you couldn't claim in these various scenarios. So just to give yourself the best possible start and the best possible protection if there's any later disputes as to whether you're eligible, is to document everything. Make sure that you are documenting the decisions that you have made, and in light of the guidance that's available at this time, because we think the thrust of the scheme is to save jobs. The guidance is helpful, but it's falls short in a number of areas, and therefore, as an employer, if you're trying to justify retrospectively the decisions that were made, far better to have them documented at the time to say, look, this is the documents that we had. Here's the email trail or the board minutes to show why we felt we were eligible to claim. Rather than retrospectively 3 or 4 years down the line when HMRC knock on the door and you're trying to remember why you made these decisions and what the justification was. So contemporaneous records, both in respect of the decision to apply the furlough arrangements within your business, and any time you apply discretion as to who goes into the scheme, or where you are going to do a rotation system, or if you're going to rehire people, or if you're going to apply some discretionary top-up to the government's contributions, make sure you've got a good and lawful business justification that's documented. Doesn't have to be very long. You just need something in writing that gives you something to fall back on.
Brilliant. Charlie, thank you so much for that. It was really, really helpful, and I hope that everyone who signed up and was involved found it useful as well. Apologies that some of you had some issues with the audio. As we said, what we can do is we can send out the link via YouTube, so my colleague Jess in marketing can pick that up. Thanks for everyone who tuned in. Also, as we mentioned, we do have another seminar tomorrow with Claire Francis, partner at Vincent Masons, talking about the legal complexities around coronavirus. And yes, well, thank you so much for joining us, and stay safe, and hope to see you again soon. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.